Hello, everyone. You are listening to the latest Flyers Talk podcast presented by Great Railing. I am Jordan Hall, and as always, I am joined by the wonderful Taryn Hatcher and the dynamic Joe Fordyce, our Flyers pre- and post-game live producer. And we had a busy Tuesday in Flyers land because General Manager Chuck Fletcher and Assistant General Manager Brent Flair addressed the media talking all things all season, from the expansion draft to the entry draft, to free agency, to trade dialogue, and also organizational changes that will soon be announced. So a lot to discuss as a busy July picks up. Taryn, I'm going to start with you. What was probably your biggest takeaway in terms of the discussion about the expansion draft and how the Flyers will attack that and approach it?
Well, it is interesting. The one thing that stood out to me is that, I think we all remember, and we kind of, it hit everybody like a wave back when free agency or trade deadline was coming up, and Chuck was saying phones are I'm calling people, I'm not getting a lot of calls back, whatever. And then when he's talking now about the summer and the trade market and the expansion draft and whatever, he said there's a lot of calls coming out and I'm getting a lot of calls coming in, which means that, I think everyone expected or really wants Chuck to make some moves this summer, but it makes you feel a little bit better about the possibility of making those moves. The fact that he said that first round draft pick was, him and Brent made me laugh because, Chuck was like, yeah, I'd be willing to, trade that pick if certain things made sense or whatever. And Brent kind of clearly, and he made a joke about it, that I would rather not retell and kill any funniness of it, where he was kind of like, yeah, and I would really like to hold on to that draft pick. So it is interesting, and it's very reassuring to know that even though everything didn't go well, that, Chuck's kind of, every time you see Chuck Fletcher, he's always at practice and he's always paying attention while holding a phone call, like in my experience with him. So I had no doubt that he's making a million calls a day, but it is nice to hear that there has been a swift change from, prior to the trade deadline, when he was basically like, I'm getting stood up for the dance every time I ask somebody to come with me. Now he's got some people ringing his phone. The other thing, and I tweeted about this as a joke, but I genuinely do feel this way, when Brent Flair said, it's been pretty highly publicized that there's not really a generational player in this draft. I was like, watch, whoever gets selected at number 14 will go on to be like the Bergeron or the Pasternak or one of those guys who didn't get selected right at the very top, 1 to 5 spots, who goes on and becomes like some wild talent. It just gives me anxiety immediately, but I'm hoping that I'm wrong there. It's just, as I said when I tweeted it, it's probably just born and bred doom and gloom Philly sports fan, where you're constantly looking over your shoulder. Whoever gets picked right after the Flyers selection, wherever that may be, like if they make some trades or whatever, I will have their name circled on a roster for the next 5 years. And I'm just going to make sure to keep track of their point totals for the next 5 years.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting too, how, Chuck Fletcher noted how, the Seattle Kraken do not have any cap pressures. They're building from scratch, obviously. So they do have the flexibility to maybe take a really good player with a higher cap. So that could tell you that the Flyers are obviously going to probably put some players on there with higher caps, because that's a great avenue to take in order to get cap relief. And Chuck Fletcher did say he has talked to Ron Francis, the GM of Seattle, numerous times. I found it interesting that he said he has made them aware of if they're interested in a side deal or something of that nature in order to maybe spice things up or sweeten things up. They're open to that. But it sounded like that was more in Seattle's hands. If they see a player that they like and they maybe want to see if there's more there, they'll approach the Flyers. But the Flyers are very comfortable submitting their list and having Seattle take a look at it and then go from there. So protection list goes in July 17th. The expansion draft is July 21. So there's a little window there where maybe Seattle can look at their list and then see if they want to do something differently. Joe, what was one of your biggest takeaways from all the discussion about the expansion draft and how the Flyers are going after it?
I will say the amount of times that Chuck mentioned about the difficulty of maneuvering in the flat cap era, and how a lot of the things that are being discussed are dollar for dollar type moves. I found that interesting because he brought it up a number of times. So, I mean, it's all stuff we know, though, right? We know that this is not a run-of-the-mill type of NHL climate in the off season. Not only with the expansion draft, but just teams' inability to spend money, and that's why the Flyers are in the position they're in, because there's not a lot of teams willing to take on money. So, but I agree that the whole him pointing out that Seattle doesn't have any cap issues is interesting to me, because that leads me to believe there's been some discussions about things and maybe some of the side type of deals that you alluded to there, that I think there could be, there could be some stuff going on there with that. And also, I found it particularly notable that he did not jump to the defense of any of the players that are making the big salaries on the Flyers. There were a lot of questions about the guys that make a lot of money. By my count, I don't believe any of their names were used during the presser. And there was never a point where he made it clear, oh, we have to protect guy X or guy Y or guy Z. They were just talked about like they were numbers. I don't really think that's what Chuck Fletcher's approach is normally. So I found that to be particularly interesting. And he may be doing it just to not to have something go viral and, tip his hand at all. But in the past with this team, I feel like there's always been a rush to jump to the defense of the guys that are in the core of this team, like that are core guys on this team. And I didn't necessarily get that impression today. So I found that particularly interesting. And what Taryn mentioned about Brett Flair mentioning there's not a generational player, to me, I hear that and I say, everything's on the table. They don't value this pick to the point where they would not consider trading it. And I think him saying that definitively, definitively makes that obvious that they say that. I mean, they said it a lot in the draft that Nolan Patrick was into, that there wasn't a generational player. I don't know that that's going to end up being true. It might be true of the top two picks in the draft, but, there are other players in that draft that I think will be generational. So, as Taryn mentioned, you kind of, whatever they do, if they make a pick, you watch the pick after. If they trade the pick, you watch the pick that was, taken with their selection, and you kind of hold on for dear life and hope that guy does not become a generational player. Much like we've talked about on this podcast with Cole Caulfield.
I was going to say, Cole Caulfield really made like this postseason a little bit so fun to watch, but also just like makes me want to grind my teeth. And I'm like, and not to say that Cam York won't become something great for this team. I think it seems like he's got promise, but you're just like so quickly made such an impact. Like, are you kidding? But it's
and we discussed, like, to make an impact in that city in a Stanley Cup final run as a rookie is just, it's both of those Eastern Canadian teams, the Maple Leafs and the Canadians. It seems like those cities feast on their young, and a guy's career could be ruined very early there because of the amount of pressure. Now, I understand the Bell Center was not packed during these playoffs, but look at what was outside of it. The pressure was there, and for him to deliver with that kind of pressure on him, it does make you look back at that draft, and you just hope that doesn't happen with whatever the Flyers decide to do in this coming draft, whether it be trade the pick, choose where they are. You don't want to constantly be looking at what could have been. But as Taryn mentioned earlier with the growing up a Philly fan, what could have been should be, like when you fly in and you come in Philly airport, there should be a sign hanging that you walk through that says, "Welcome to Philadelphia." and then what could have been in quotes, because I feel like every team in the city, everyone does that all the time.
Nerlens Noel and Jahlil Okafor and this guy and that guy. And so, and that Carson picture that they just took down at the link, that's up there too. Like, yeah, no.
And, and Jason Tatum's face next to Markelle Fultz and, you know, those sorts of things.
Yes. Like, it's, I don't want to turn this into another Canadians podcast because I know we talked about this, I think the last podcast that I was on, Jordan, but like, to Joe's point about feasting on their young, how many times were people ready to like have Marc Bergevin's head during last season? And then it's players like Caulfield and certain guys turning it around. And all of a sudden they're in the Stanley Cup final, and the entire, like, this is the one thing that, and I wanted to say it on one of the previous podcasts because it's so true. Like when an SEC team makes it to the national title game, the entire SEC is like, well, that's our team. Like they might hate them, but it's that SEC pride. It felt like that, but about Canada when it came to the Canadians playing this. Like, it was like, you know,
you had the CN Tower in Toronto lit up in Montreal Canadiens colors.
Like you have just like some of the saltiest rivalries of all time up there, and still it's just like, doesn't matter. They're our guys. We're on their side. We're backing them. And it was very wild to watch. But yeah, it'll be like Joe said, no matter what happens, if the Flyers trade that pick, and like there were a lot of context clues, and it's hard to tell also when you're not in person, like, am I reading into this too much? Or, you know, were there just certain like lines that they wanted to use to pivot out of different answers? Because that is true. Like, that does happen with front office guys. They'll have ways to pivot out of things, and in the process, they'll be repetitive about certain statements that either end up meaning a lot or end up not meaning anything. But it did really seem like they were not incredibly invested in that first round draft. It just doesn't seem like they are married to it, which I do think speaks to the fact that like they've gone young for forever. And I do think they need some proven people now. But it was interesting because it just didn't seem overly emphasized. Whereas in the past, it's, you know, we talk about this all the time. The Flyers were like the future for so long. And then the 2019-2020 season, it's like the future is here. And then this season, it was like, dude, the future wasn't what we thought it was. And now I think in order to prove that those moves did make sense back then, and they will make sense in the long term, I think they need guys now. But that is what will be interesting about this whole expansion draft situation, is that the only way to get guys now, and it became pretty apparent the way Chuck was talking about it. The only way to get guys now is to have the money to do so. The only way to open up money to do so is to try to entice, I mean, Seattle more than anybody else, to take some of your dollars, some of your players who equate big money. And it'll be interesting. I also found it kind of interesting when Jordan, you were actually the journalist who asked the question about like, have you talked to the guys you're not going to protect yet? And they said, no, like we've had, you know, I've had conversations with some people, but we haven't explicitly had that conversation of, hey, you won't be protected. I mean, I would imagine there's still quite a few days before the expansion draft, but it does seem like, and I'm sure you don't want to tell a guy too, because you don't want certain things to leak. Like there is a science to some of these things. But it seemed like Chuck was pretty comfortable when talking about his protection lists. I know he would tell us, but it didn't seem like he was like, it's going to be really hard. Like it seemed like he was pretty confident in saying whenever he would talk about his protection lists. And so in my mind, I think he's probably had this list. They've probably had it locked in for at least a little while now. They probably have certain moves that he's working on, and, you know, the players that they'll protect probably aren't a part of those moves and so on and so forth. Or they're part of the moves, but post-expansion draft, essentially. But he hasn't talked to any of the players about it. Makes sense to me from you don't want leaks. You don't want certain guys written about in a certain way longer than it needs to be, because I'm sure it's look, just the Shane Gostisbehere saga. Like, I think that was a really hard decision for the team. And in the public, he kind of got raked over the coals, and then he came back and he played well. But that was another thing that stood out to me, where it's like, I feel like he's probably had this list locked in from like right after the season ended. And I wonder when he will talk to those guys, but that's just like a human curiosity side of everything.
Karen, to your point there too, and Jordan, I back to what I had said, something that stood out to me, and Karen just kind of reinforced it a little bit. I felt like today, personal feelings about guys seemed to be taken out of that press conference. And in the past, I felt like that Chuck was big on that. He was big on personal connections to certain players. And earlier when I mentioned him not mentioning guys by name or not really defending the guys that make big salaries on this roster, and then him mentioning that he hasn't talked to the people who they're going to leave exposed, in response to your question there, Jordan, you know, there seemed to be a lack of human feeling, which I don't, and I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. I'm saying that that is kind of it's almost like, as a GM, you have to be a little bit cold-blooded, right? The successful GMs in all of sports are a little bit cold-blooded, and you hear the cliche all the time, it's business is business. And I felt like at this press conference this morning, business was business. And I don't know that I always have felt that way when Chuck Fletcher has addressed the media about personnel moves.
Yeah, and I think he was probably trying to keep things as general as possible instead of getting into specifics about big name guys that are expected to be exposed. And he did say that he did have some conversations with some guys about the likelihood of their plans, and that some guys probably had an idea of what the Flyers were going to do. One of those guys I think is cut and dry. You know, they probably had conversations with is Jacob Voracek. One, I think Voracek has warranted the right to have conversations with the GM about the future of him because he's been here 10 years. He's a name. He's one of their leadership guys. So I have a feeling they probably have talked to Jacob Voracek, and we know that also from a report by Elliot Freeman of Sportsnet that they have had conversations with Jacob Voracek about a possible change for both sides. And that probably starts with exposing Jacob Voracek in the expansion draft, leaving that big cap hit out there of $8.25 million. And if it doesn't happen in the expansion draft, then maybe possibly looking at parting ways via trade over the course of the offseason. So I would think that's one player that he has probably had a conversation about. But yeah, Fletcher definitely kept things close to the vest. It sounded like they had the expansion draft list, the protection list already set. Probably not written in stone yet because there are about 4 days to go before they have to submit that list, but they're probably ready to go, and they have what their plans are. They had their pro scouts in town to make sure everything was ready to go, and that they came together and had the best list possible. But yeah, there's no hiding it. The Flyers have some guys with term and some guys with money, and in order to get better in this flat cap world, you have to get cap relief, and it's just natural. It's the business of sports. When guys are older and they have term and they have money to their names, you start to look to move them. And the expansion draft now is just a very interesting, fascinating thing in this season where you don't typically have an expansion draft. It's just a way to clear money, and it's the business of it. But yeah, I found it very interesting, like Taryn said, and like you said, Joe, that he still will probably inform some guys. Obviously, the guys that they're exposing, there's a number of them. From big name guys to guys that probably have only played a handful of games. So, you know, they'll probably go out and reach out to some of these, or if not most of them, and let them know, hey, here's why we did, we are exposing you. A lot of them probably know they're being exposed and not protected, but just another interesting element to it all. But yeah, let's get into that draft pick, the number 13th overall draft pick. As you both have mentioned, that doesn't sound like the Flyers are really tied to that too tightly. And I think it makes sense in a lot of ways. Taryn, what did you think about what they had to say about the number 13 overall pick being out there on the table for trade discussions?
I personally am wasn't surprising when we heard it. Like I kind of said before, I think Chuck, and I think it's also to Joe's point about, like, in the past, Chuck has openly showed a lot of compassion to the point of defending his players in the midst of like their most rock bottom this past season, and you didn't exactly do that today. I think, to be fair to Chuck, and this will all tie back into the 13th spot answer, I promise. Chuck is as personable as he is professional. So there's two sides to that coin, where when I think when he really saw players on a very human level struggling, he was like, I am going to go out there and I will be the human shield. And he took a bunch of crap for it, to be fair. Like in a city like Philly too, people don't want to hear like the young guys are having a hard time being alone. Like it's just not really what I think anywhere people buy into. But Chuck, I think he was the one who, took that sword in that situation. And then I think when the team didn't turn it around, and I think he probably had very frank conversations with a lot of players, as Jordan, you said, like, I'm sure he's had those conversations pretty early on where he alluded to the fact of, hey, this is in play and this might be what happens with you. And we just want to give you a heads up, blah, blah, blah. That's part of the side of it where you take the personable aspect of Chuck Fletcher and kind of put it away and then put on your professional hat. And I think today, because you're dealing with something where you can't really let the human emotions of a lot of things bleed in on some of this stuff. I think that's why we saw the more professional side of Chuck. And I think that very frank answer about like, yeah, like we're not really married to this 13 spot, which he did not say, I am paraphrasing, but that was that is how I received his response to that particular thing. Because him even joking about like, Brent would like me to keep this pick. I am very open to trading it. Like, I thought that was very apparent. It became very apparent to me that like, Chuck's not really in this to mess around and to play games, not even publicly with us, the media. Like, he's just like, here's the deal. If I can get something worthwhile, that pick will go, was kind of how I took it. And I think that's where I have a ton of respect for Chuck. And I'm sure he learned it from his dad as well, is that at some point you just have to be like, here's the no BS of everything. This is how this is going to go. And that's what I took from it. And I think that's probably what's best for the Flyers' future. I think the reason why he didn't say like straight up, we're probably going to trade that pick, I don't really care about it, was because if they don't get a good trade for it, they won't trade it. And then it will look bad that he said that they were going to try to trade it. So I think he played that perfectly, because if they can get something decent, I think you'll see that pick go. If they can get rid of Jake Voracek, I think you'll see that pick go to Seattle. And if they can't, if the Flyers end up picking at 13, I think it's because there was a trade situation on the table that got taken off the table, and Chuck didn't like what he could get for that 13th pick. That is my assessment of the situation.
Taryn, I would agree with that too, because he basically he came right up to the line of saying we're trying to trade the pick and did everything but say the words, we are trying to trade this pick. Almost to the point where I felt like when Brett Flair answered the question about the pick and who would be there, it was almost like, yeah, this really, it might not really matter that much who's there, because that chip and that pick is more valuable in another capacity for this team other than drafting a player at 13.
Flyers Talk is brought to you by Great Railing. Stop into Great Railing for the highest quality and lowest prices on all your railing, decking, and fencing needs.
Jordan, how did you take all of that? Because I feel like different things catch me different ways, and then I'll talk to somebody else and they will have a massively different interpretation of the situation. I wonder, because you're probably like, and Joe, I think this is fair for both of us to say, Jordan, you're probably the most like even keeled. I don't read too much into anything out of the three of us. What was your takeaway from the way Chuck addressed the expansion draft and the 13th overall pick, and how he feels about the draft in general?
Yeah, I thought two notable things were, one, Chuck Fletcher did admit he probably would be more willing to move the pick compared to years past. And I think that's very obvious, because the Flyers are in a spot where they need to get better by a lot for next season. Next season is highly important. They need to get better. So that pick is a great asset. Another notable thing I thought that he said was that they're going to want high value in return for that pick, not just a player that's going to help make them better next season, but make them better in the short term and the long term. So I think they will hold that pick in high regard. He called it a high value asset. So I will not be surprised at all if the Flyers hold on to that pick and make a selection. And I will also say, the 3 years now that I've known Chuck Fletcher and that we've talked to him about the NHL draft, every single year he has said that first round pick is in play. He's never once said, I'm not trading our first round pick. He has always said they will be willing to move it for the right price. But I will say this year, and he admitted that they will be more willing probably to move that pick in years past. And I think it's notable because this year the draft is just so unique. It's so different. You both know how different this draft is. There's going to be so much unknown across the board. They admitted, Brent Flair said after the 8-9 range, there's going to be a ton of variance in the draft. There's going to be some guys that obviously teams like that these guys didn't even play this season. So there's going to be so much unknown that I think there will be a lot of intrigue in that 13th pick, because there could be a team a little further back from them that might love a kid, and they might have no idea what the Flyers feel about that player. That they might be say, hey, we love this kid. We feel like he might go there and we want to move up. So I think the element of unknown with this draft makes that pick even more attractive of an asset. And the Flyers have all the reason to use that asset because they need to get better. So
that's why this draft terrifies me, though. That is why, sorry, Joe. That is why, like, I said the thing that I said about there's no generational players and number 14 will be a generational player because of, whatever. That's what scares me, is because junior hockey, like hockey on all the prospect levels has been thrown so out of whack, so into the blender for the past 2 years. So you could have some wildly naturally gifted player who you have not seen fully develop and mature over the past 2 seasons, who somebody, like, to what you just said, Jordan, like somebody could feel like that kid is gold and everybody else is going to see him as gold. Like they're going to know that to get him at 13 is a steal. Yeah. And it wouldn't be people like us who know. It would be those scouts whose job it is to go sit in rinks in regions across the country and Canada and Europe and so on and so forth. That is what terrifies me about this draft, is we don't even really truly know. And to Brent's point, like he pointed out, we can kind of guess. It's very almost NFL draft like in the way he worded it, is you can kind of guess 1 through 8, 1 through 9. You sort of know where they're going to go. Like maybe 7 and 8 are interchangeable for different teams and their needs and so on and so forth. But after that, it's kind of the wild, wild west. It should be really interesting to see.
I found it very interesting too. And Joe, I want to get your thoughts and Terrence's thoughts. Kind of shifting gears a little bit toward free agency, which of course opens on July 28th. A very big time period for the Flyers. July to begin with is huge. But when you think of expansion and entry draft, but also free agency, I found it interesting that Chuck Fletcher said this summer's a lot like other summers. He's not treating it. I think he knows there is external pressure and maybe even a little internal pressure as well, given the season that they had, the previous offseason that they had. But he was treating it a lot like other summers. And he said that what other summers are like is, listen, we want to be as competitive as possible next season, and we want to get better, and they know they have to. He called their goals against figure last year, which, of course, was the highest in the NHL. He called it ridiculous how many goals they gave up. So he knows the pressure, but he did say they want to be competitive next season, but they're also going to keep the future in mind. They're going to try to make moves with the future in mind and not mortgage the future. So for those out there wanting Chuck Fletcher just to do something, please do something. They're not going to jeopardize the club's future and all that they've worked at to really just get better next season. They're going to have the future in mind. I think that's just smart general managing. Joe, what did you think of that? Do you feel like there maybe should be some more pressure on him to make a move more about next season and not the future?
Well, you had just mentioned that they continue to say that next season is a big deal. And going back to the draft, like the 13th pick is not going to help them next season.
Yeah.
That's not going to help next season's result by picking a guy at 13. So I'm not saying they don't value it, but what I'm saying is that 13th pick coupled with, might be part of a deal to alleviate some cap space to be able to do something in free agency, which I think is more valuable than any of the stuff we're talking about here, because there's no flexibility within the roster as it currently stands because of these big contracts. So, you have to use the draft pick. I think the draft pick has to go in hand with either trades or free agency or both, because you have to entice a team to take on a big deal. They're not just going to take it from you because, for example, Seattle, I mean, Dave Haxtell is familiar with almost everyone on this Flyers roster. And in particular, the guys that make the money, Voracek, Gostisbehere, Giroux, he coached all these guys. I mean, he saw the best of the best from Ghost. So, you know, it's not like you're not going to get one over on Seattle.
No.
And you have a coach there that is very familiar with all these guys. So I think that pick will go hand in hand with free agency. And, you know, I think free agency is going to depend on if they can make a trade, because we've talked about Seth Jones. Last week, we talked about some other trade potential, and I mentioned John Klingberg from Dallas also entering the last year of his deal, and pieces that might be out there. And that might be the more attractive pool, because there's more guys, and it may be able to help your team in a less difficult way than needing to clear up cap space to sign a guy like Dougie Hamilton and potentially overpay given the amount of suitors that will be in the mix for a guy like Dougie Hamilton.
Yeah, it really is interesting how it all ties together. Like free agency ties together with trades, and expansion ties together with trades and free agency, because it really comes down so much to cap relief and can you make room for guys that you're looking to bring in. I think the Flyers have about $13 million in cap space according to Cap Friendly and Puckpedia. That's without new restricted free agent deals, guys that are RFAs getting new deals. So we'll see how much wiggle room the Flyers have. And Taryn, another thing to add into this busy offseason was the Flyers and Chuck Fletcher mentioning that they'll have a lot of staff changes. Obviously, they're looking for a new assistant head coach. They're looking for a new assistant coach on their big club staff. They'll have 2 new assistants in Lehigh Valley under Ian LaPerriere. And it looks like they'll have some other changes within maybe scouting and stuff like that. So they mentioned they worked a lot this summer on their structure and what they want to do from a development standpoint to a staffing standpoint and just everything. I think Chuck Fletcher, Brent Flair, and them are really starting to put their imprint on the organization in year 3 now that they've taken over the team. So what did you make of that? It should be very interesting when these moves come out. They're going to announce them soon.
Yeah, I'm interested to see what moves they make. There were certain, just real brief comments about we're reevaluating the way we do some of our conditioning and analytic, all of that stuff. And I've seen the way that they've done, and all of us have up close and personal, the way that they do their conditionings and their analysis just in terms of conditioning. So if you don't really love analytics in hockey, I think maybe you're a little bit behind, and that's going to change no matter what. But if you can't argue with analytics when it comes to conditioning and seeing how much water guys lose and how much protein they need and what kind of workouts work for different players and so on and so forth. And they monitor the past 2 years since Chuck and really since AV have gotten in there, they have someone sitting at the end of the arena with a computer live monitoring everything. And I've sat in on certain pregame skates for other teams, but I've been pretty limited in terms of sitting in on other teams' actual practices. So I'd love to know how common it is, the amount of just monitoring that kind of stuff. But I think it'll be interesting because that was something, as much as everybody talked about Ron being Ron Hextall, I'm talking about being restrictive in terms of the nutritionist and this, that, and the next thing. I noticed a kick up in terms of conditioning analytics once Chuck and AV took over. So I'll be interested to see if there's some changes made there at all. And then I just would love to see who Lappy puts on his staff as well, because I was at a charity golf tournament and talking to all the front office guys from Lehigh Valley and then talking to Ian LaPerriere. And they could not be more excited to have Lappy there, just in terms of who he is, how he is as a coach, which is really, he's a very similar coach to the type of personality that he is. He's just very helpful and very relatable. I think his career speaks for itself and his toughness speaks for itself, certainly. But I'd be interested to see who he puts on that staff. I would be interested to see if there's some other former Flyers on that staff as well, or some of Lappy's former teammates. Just, I don't know anything. It's just like an inkling that I have. But
would the name Rick Tocchet be involved in that?
I don't know. I mean, I think Rick wants a head coaching NHL job. I'm still shocked that Rick doesn't have a head coaching NHL job, but that's I'm biased because I just love Rick.
I did see his name mentioned in terms of being an assistant in Calgary, which is the only reason I bring up an assistant here. And you mentioned Hextall. We should probably mention he brought Kerry Huffman out to Pittsburgh now too. So he's got a lot of Flyers, too much for comfort, too much orange and black out there with the black and yellow for comfort these days.
It's so annoying. I mean, I have so much appreciation for Ron and what he means to the Flyers franchise, but I'm just like, oh my gosh, Ron, just leave us alone. Just leave us alone. Just leave us alone. But, whatever. Yeah, it'll be interesting, Jordan. I have no idea who, what, where, why, when will be changed. I know they said they would announce it soon, but they made it sound like they made a lot of changes. And so I kind of wonder, because I know there's quite a few positions that were vacated that they need to fill. But some of the stuff that they were touching on weren't specifically like Lappy. Joe and I had heard in the newsroom the one day, like Lappy is the coach you love and hate the most because 30 seconds after you get off the ice, he's tapping on the shoulder with an iPad saying, let me show you what you did wrong right here. And it's helpful, but it's annoying. But there's that guy on every team. It just so happens that Lappy was that guy on this team. So it'll be interesting to see how they replace, he's the most likable guy to do that job. So I'll be interested to see how the next guy handles that job, because it's like being an internal auditor. Like, it's just on its face, an unfriendly job, and people still love Lappy and the way he did it. So should be interesting.
Yeah. Chuck Fletcher said it was a really busy offseason behind the scenes. He said they spent about 2 months looking at everything in terms of their structure within the organization. He mentioned from coaching to development, data, scouting, they wanted to fix things. And I think, again, it's sort of people that are now in the organization, new people, really putting their imprint on things. It's now year 3 with Chuck Fletcher and Brent Flair. Next season will be year 3. Obviously, it will be year 3 with Elaine Vigneault. So I think they're really starting to put their imprint, and we're going to have to see how it looks and also what the results are. It's great to hear the organization is being very proactive, but ultimately it's going to come down to results. And was the team's rebuilding and retooling everything behind the scenes, will it produce results? Time will tell. But it does sound like they've had a crazy offseason, and it's really just getting started in many ways. Joe and Taryn, as we heard, Chuck Fletcher took more responsibility, as he did at the end of the season in May. He said it starts with him. He called last season unacceptable. So I think they know the pressure is on to get better this offseason, but I don't think they're changing course, wholesale changes. That could come on the roster, but I think they know they still have a good foundation, and they really believe with normalcy and with a good offseason, they can kind of get back to where they want to be. But there was a lot of onus on Chuck Fletcher. He felt it. He explained it. And it's a good segue into our cold brew check presented by Duncan. Should the Flyers trade that number 13 overall pick, their first round selection? I think that's a very attractive asset. And I think it's going to be a fascinating balance of Chuck Fletcher thinking future, but also understanding the pressure now. That's going to, I think, be the story of the offseason for him, is making sure they're not jeopardizing the future, but also understanding there is a pressure to make the team better next season. Joe, I'll start with you. Our cold brew check presented by Duncan. Should the Flyers trade that pick?
I think they absolutely should trade it. There is an element to this of there needs to be some buzz created around this team heading into next season. Selecting anybody at the 13th pick does not create that. Trading the 13th pick as part of something bigger can create that. And I'm pretty sure any big moves they're going to have to make is going to involve having to move that pick. So I think they absolutely should move the pick. I'm not saying move it for anything. I'm saying move it as part of a bigger plan, because there needs to be an infusion of energy into this franchise right now, heading into next season. And I feel like the 13th pick, combined with some other things, is an avenue to doing just that, to kind of breathing some new life into a franchise that, I would say some would argue, and fans in particular would say, things have gotten a little stale lately. And I feel like any move that is going to go a good way in changing that is going to need to include that 13th pick. So I say absolutely they have to trade the pick.
Yeah, Taryn, how about you? I think it makes it more of an attractive asset, and also an asset to burn, because it's not a top 10 pick, but it's high enough of a pick that it is going to be appealing to teams, and maybe you can convince yourself, hey, yeah, this is the year to do it. And I'll say this: I think there's always an interest among the fan base in the draft and who the Flyers are getting in the first round. But I think this year, probably for the first time in a while, I think there's going to be the least amount of interest in that pick among the fan base, because they are so set on getting better now, whether it's a big splash in free agency or a big splash in the trade market. What do you think? How will they use that pick?
Well, like we've talked about before, this year, especially more than ever with the flat cap and the expansion, picks and trades and free agency and expansion draft, everything is more tied into each other than it's ever been before. And I think that pick is like the perfect size nugget to fit, really, like you were just saying, Jordan, to fit into being okay with keeping it, being okay with trading it. But to Joe's point as well, and it is a thing that matters, is that I think you have to, from a fan base point of view, and I think probably within the locker room as well, you have to rejuvenate this team somehow. And your 13th overall pick this season is not, like, there's not going to be a Connor McDavid at 13, knock on wood, that I'm aware of. So, for me, it's like, this is a, no duh moment, but like, you need Chuck Fletcher to be as aggressive as possible. You need him to do something with, I love Jake. I love working with Jake. I love interacting with Jake. And I think people underplay how much Jake contributed to the team point wise this season. But I think you do need to try to do something with Jake because of that money, or anyone with that money. And I think it's probably Jake more than JVR right now. And I think you need to, the big names in this city have been, like Joe said, things have gotten a little bit stale. The big names have been the big names in the city for so long. And I think people have become so highly critical and kind of stale when it comes to that core. And I would imagine that Chuck is as aware as everyone else is that, like, with the amount of young talent you have on this team that, yes, did underperform this past year, but no, I don't expect them to underperform at that level next season. If you can get a new big name in, if you can create some excitement about a new big name core, and you can try to build something around that, you don't have to break everything that exists up, because when the team was good, they were good as an ensemble. So it's not like you're breaking apart all of the important pieces. But I think if you shift some things around to update the big name core in some way, that's what you need to try to use that 13th overall pick to do. And it's not going to get it done by itself. I'm sure it's going to take some big movement, but like, the Fletcher family is known to make big moves. Like, Chuck's dad was a part of like a 9-player trade or something wild like that back in the day. It's not like he probably knows more than anyone else how seeing things 8 steps ahead. But I think he needs to this year, quite frankly. I think he needs to. I think that holding on to that 13th pick will feel, at least in the immediate future, like a consolation prize for not making something else happen. And I just pray and hope to God that if they do get rid of it, that 13th overall player just becomes like a solid dude who doesn't overly contribute moving forward, because then I'm going to be like so wrong in this situation. But I just think you've got to like it. Stale is the best word. I think people have become stale, like when it comes to the up and comers aren't up and comers anymore. They're here, and the core isn't the stars that they used to be, at least on the level that they used to be. And I think you need to brighten them up somehow. And I think a big name's going to do it. If you guys can hear booming in the background, it's not you, it is me and my whoever is moving outside, by the way. So I apologize on behalf of that. They're like clanging heavy rocks together or something. I don't even know.
It sounds like the Flyers' newest acquisition is moving into your complex, Terry. That could be it.
Oh my gosh. Can you imagine? Like, it's got to be a Punisher if you're making this much noise. It got to be huge. That'll get the fan base fired up. Just like a baby pronger running through brick walls into my building. That would be great. I'd be really into that. Does Darian Hatcher have a kid?
I would just add, Jordan and Taryn, that what Taryn just mentioned there about the staleness, it's not even so much that they've been the core for so long. It's been so long since they won anything. That's the bigger issue. Because Tom Brady, I don't think anything got stale with New England with him because he kept winning. Yeah. I don't think anything got stale with the Edmonton Oilers when Gretzky and those guys were there because they kept winning.
Yeah.
And you know what's a shame is
consistency combined with not winning produces staleness. And I think that's what we've gotten to here. And also the point you mentioned, Taryn, I'm going to quote Al Morgani earlier during the season with us in our newsroom. Players, and Jordan and I have talked about this before on the podcast, players like Travis Sanheim and that group of players that came up under Hextall, they have to stop being considered young guys. They're not young guys.
They're not young anymore.
Of experience. And to keep saying they're young guys, I think people get tired of hearing young guys because then that just becomes a stigma over the organization to get these young guys. And you're hearing about young guys for 4 and 5 years. Meanwhile, other teams' young guys are up and playing and contributing big time. I mean, we already talked about Cole Caulfield, but look at Cale Makar. I mean, look across the league. It's a young guys league, and young guys are in the NHL contributing to teams, not lingering in the minor leagues and being talked about by the front office of their teams as things that are still to come. They're here now. And that's, I think, a bit of an issue with this franchise right now is a few years down the road or the future, at some point, the future has to be now.
Yeah. Well, and the tough part is, and Joe kind of touched on this, and I think it is kind of part of the big reason why it's like this, something has to change with this core now, is that the team has never really been bad enough that you justifiably blow up the core. We've talked about it over and over again. They are consistently the most inconsistent team in the history of all 4 major sports in all of North America. Make a playoff, miss a playoff, make a playoff, miss a playoff for 10 consecutive years. And so you always think it's like a toxic relationship. You're like, oh no, but he's changing. And then like something happens again. And it's one of those things where it's like, at some point you do have to, I think, kind of cut bait with certain things and figure out that like, there are greener pastures elsewhere. And yeah, it is nice sometimes, but it would be nice to be nice most of the time. And that's not really what we get right now. And that 13th pick in conjunction with, one of those up and coming guys who's 24, so should really be in his prime, like that pick with like maybe a young guy, or, if you can entice a Jake Voracek and use that money and spend a ton or whatever. I mean, we haven't even, like you touched on, Jordan, earlier, like we haven't even talked about restricted free agents. Like some of them have to get paid. Some of them, like reality situation is like Sanheim's probably going to make a fair amount of cash. Like that's going to take a dent into the cap hit. So I know he didn't have a great season last year, but he is a very attractive player to a lot of teams, just his raw abilities. So, there's a lot to figure out.
And you have Sean Couturier looming after next season.
Oh yeah, 1,000%. Like we don't even, they need to budget like they're trying to buy a house in this housing market somewhere in the suburbs. Like they have to budget that hard right now to pay for Sean Couturier later, because I can't even imagine what he will fetch in other places. And like, there's just, I'm all for like, use that 13th pick and go get yourself some cash or like a player or something. Go figure it out. Just figure it out. Just
I
figure it out.
think fans will share that sentiment with Joe and Taryn. And what's wild too is in sports how fast things can change. Like I really thought they were starting to turn the page from stagnancy last season, and we saw it. They got a game away from the East Final. They hired a head coach from within the division in Elaine Vigneault, total outsider. Their two main assistants that came in, total outsiders, even coached in Pittsburgh at one point. The GM that they hired, Chuck Fletcher, out organizational. He was outside the organization. They brought guys in from outside the organization, and I thought they were finally turning the page from like that stagnant stretch of like 7 seasons. And then 2020-21 happens, and it really almost feels like they're kind of back to square one in terms of being stale again. And
they're the Ross and Rachel of NHL teams. Will they, won't they? Will they, won't they? Will they, won't they? Will they, won't they? We don't know.
Great analogy. So I think that's this
also. Well, let's hope that it ends the way that did, because they did at the end. So hopefully that is the Stanley Cup.
She didn't get on the plane to Paris. She didn't get on the plane to Paris. And then they have a baby. Like, it's just... And
then 20 years later, or 20 however many years later, they have a reunion.
Yeah.
And they admit that they like each other the whole time. It's just everything comes full circle. All right, I drove this train off the track.
No, it's okay.
Just once an episode, I have to drive the train off the tracks. That's what I got to do.
So we will see. I don't think they're back at square one. It may feel like they are, but they do have a long ways to go. As Chuck Fletcher mentioned, they allowed the most goals in hockey. They went from 7th to 31st. So that all that progress in 2019-20, they took a major step backward. They need to get going forward again, and it could take their biggest moves yet to get there. To close our cold brew check presented by Duncan, I hate to be the bland one, but I feel like I'm 50-50. I feel like if they traded the pick, I would not be surprised at all. I feel like if they kept the pick, I would also be like, hey, maybe they just didn't get the value that they wanted, the long-term and short-term value in that trade that they wanted, so they kept it. We will see, but that was the cold brew check presented by Duncan. This season, be sure to grab a cold brew for game time, because where there's hockey, there's Duncan. And that also is for next season too, and the offseason. But anyway, Joe and Taryn, great chatting with you guys as always. A busy July ahead, and I cannot wait to talk about all of it with you. Expansion draft on July 21, the entry draft on July 23rd, 24th, and of course, free agency kicks off July 28th. So we'll have plenty to chat and plenty to dissect. But Joe Flores and Taryn Hatcher, thank you so much as always. Ben Barry, our podcast producer, a special thank you as well. And Flyers fans, as always, thank you for listening to the latest Flyers Talk podcast presented by Great Railing. Wherever you get your podcasts, please rate and listen, and we cannot wait to talk to you next time.